to our distinguished guests here for what promises to be an interesting conversation on energy and security issues in the Eastern Mediterranean. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I am the president of the Global Policy Institute, and which, for those of you who don't know us, we are an independent think tank, but working in close association with Bay Atlantic University, which we're all in the same building here. We just recently acquired this floor, by the way. And Bay Atlantic University is a private nonprofit university here in Washington, D.C. I serve as chair of political science and international relations. So my colleagues are here, from different disciplines, from business and economics, and we have important programs, both graduate and undergraduate, the thriving MBA program, many undergraduate programs in economics, political science, international relations, business, accounting, and now data analytics and computer science and what have you. So this is a little commercial on our behalf for those of you who are now familiar with who we are and what we're doing. But so to come to the issue of today, again, as I said, I'm very pleased that we have here with us Dr. Dupuy and Paul Michael Wihbey, who are both preeminent expert on these issues, both on the energy side and on the security side and on the region itself. As some of you, I'm sure, are well aware of, when we're talking about the Eastern Mediterranean, there's a lot going on. And some stuff is very old, clearly. Problems between Greece and Turkey are very old, and I'm sure some of them will be elaborated. I was a relatively young man when there was the Turkish intervention in Cyprus, and regrettably, since 1974, the issue has not been settled. I mean, it's still, in a way, it's still in limbo without an agreement, sadly, between the two communities, and that is something that I think affects some of the issues that we're going to talk about today, because of energy findings in the waters of Cyprus, and the question is who has what, who has jurisdiction, who doesn't, and what have you. And so more broadly, the role of Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, but then we have other players, and I don't know if there will be time to get into all of this. Israel and its own offshore findings, Egypt and its own offshore findings, Jordan being a client maybe of Israel and maybe others. Where is all this energy going to go? Pipelines, LNG, what have you. Again, I don't want to preempt what our experts will tell us. And so without further ado, let me just get this thing going. And I don't know who wants to go first. Arnold? Is that okay?
Be glad to, yeah. Thank you, Paolo.
And again, by the way, you all have bios of our experts, so I will not recite their multiple accomplishments because you can read them. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is my second event here at BAU, and very pleased to do this. Very professional and well done organization. So just to start out, well, I look at this, looking at the Eastern Mediterranean from both a commercial and from a political standpoint. So what I want to start is with the commercial side, and I think Paul Michael can get into some of the details where he has particular expertise. So from the commercial side, there's a really tremendous potential in the area. There's estimates are, again, depending on who you talk to, roughly 3 to 4 trillion cubic meters of gas somewhere within the Eastern Mediterranean. And there's extremely high demand from the local states, growing demand from the Eastern Mediterranean countries where there's growing economies and need for natural gas. There's also a huge demand from Europe, which, as I recall, takes in or imports roughly 400 billion cubic meters per year. So there's this tremendous commercial demand. There's also the technologies available to exploit these reserves. Again, it's a bit expensive when you're talking about undersea and having the liquefaction aspect of it compared to pipe gas, but still the technology is there and the ability is there and the infrastructure is there, certainly in the case of Egypt, to exploit these. But we're looking at when on the positive side you have these commercial dynamics. Getting beneath the surface, you look at some of the geopolitical aspects, and it becomes very complicated, as I'm sure everybody in the room is aware. There is certainly the Cyprus issue is extremely volatile. It's been like that for
40 years.
Well, probably before that too, but certainly in this current context, it's been since 1974. There's also gas deposits and I believe oil deposits in the Aegean, which are in limbo because of the Greek-Turkish disputes. But also, as Paolo mentioned, there's Israel, which is a player, and there are various disputes with Lebanon. Egypt and Israel also have their primarily commercial disputes, but not the highly politicized confrontations that or potential confrontations that we see. So what's happening is we see very generally speaking, we see a nexus of Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, and even Italy, forming a commercial and to a certain extent political. I want to say it's a strong alliance, but certainly a collaborative effort. And Turkey is on the outside, and for a variety of reasons, this is the case. So we see these dynamics happening, but in most cases where there's a profit motive involved, I become generally optimistic. So I see some silver linings in this. For instance, and recently the Turkish ship, what's it called, the Turkish Barbaros, I believe, has been withdrawn from Cypriot waters as an indication that Turkey may be willing to discuss some of the issues here. There's a TRNC proposal for sharing some of the revenues. Israel and Egypt are working together to extract and share the proceeds. So again, where there's a profit motive, I should say, there's always going to be a potential to overcome a lot of these issues, and I think that this is something that we can look forward to as time goes on, and realizing that Turkey and Greece and the Cypriots need to at some point hopefully extract these reserves and make the most of it and utilize the local market for their advantage. So let me stop here. Setting that rough foundation, I'll let Paul Michael delve into some of the details as he's very capable of doing.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate being here. I represent a new 501c3 policy institute. It was established in July, so we're brand new. And I'm executive director of the Institute for the Geopolitics of Energy and Strategic Resources here in Washington. And probably the very first public engagement I had occurred on July 25th when I was invited down to conduct a 2-hour course at U.S. Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico to about 18 or 19 senior reserve staff officers. These are majors, colonels, and so forth, on the very issue of Eastern Mediterranean energy geopolitics. And that was wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And at the very beginning, I mentioned that this is probably the most complicated, complex geopolitical and energy-related configuration in the entire world, well beyond anything regarding the issues pertaining to South China Sea, the Persian Gulf, or any other maritime basin that has significant resources, including the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, the North Sea. And one of the reasons for that is simply geography. This part of the world, the Eastern Mediterranean, is a small, congested space, roughly 600 miles by 400 miles. 9 different national jurisdictions surround the Eastern Mediterranean basin. Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestinian Authority, Gaza, Jordan, Egypt, and of course Cyprus. And then you have a number of external jurisdictions, national and multilateral and multinational, who have a vested interest. Italy, France, NATO, the EU, Russia, the United States, and Great Britain. And then on top of those, there are 3 U.S. combat commands who are directly involved in overseeing this region: EUCOM, CENTCOM, and Africa Command. And that's before you get to the economic and commercial layers that Dr. Dupuy referred to. And you have a multitude of companies involved in exploration and drilling and services. And there's an entire list, but some of these, of course, are well known, like Eni from Italy, Exxon,
And
Total, and Greek companies, Turkish companies, and so on. Each bringing with them the diplomatic, military, security, and economic components of their home country. So, to give you an example, since we first received the invitation to come to BAU, some of the interesting things that have happened in the last few weeks to indicate, that provides an indication how this landscape is rapidly evolving in ways that probably had not been anticipated even a month ago. So at the beginning of October, the United States and Greece signed a revised mutual defense agreement that enhances U.S. basing facilities in Crete at Suda Bay, and then right near the Turkish border at Alexandroupolis. And that's probably only 50 clicks from the Turkish border. And it represents a very direct north-south axis, which one could view as a new line in terms of U.S. defense, new defense posture as the United States begins to draw down from the Middle East region and from a certain area of the Eastern Med. And then in early November, B-52s, accompanied by Greek F-16s, flew across Greece directly to Cyprus along the Turkish coast. November 3rd, the Medusa 9 naval exercises between Egypt, Cyprus, and Greece. And November 8th, a Greek military drill on islands in the eastern Aegean, right across from Turkey. November 8th, and you may think this is not relevant, but I do believe it's quite relevant. President Macron made a statement where, in effect, he labeled NATO as being brain dead, and that Russia has 3 strategic options to consider in terms of its overall relations, including a new relationship with the European community. November 11th, the EU announces a sanctions mechanism or plan against Turkey as a consequence of the Turkish-Kurdish issue and also drilling offshore Cyprus. On November 12th, President Erdogan discussed the release of ISIS fighters from Europe back to Europe, the repatriation. And within this area, we have a number of discussions pertaining to territorial maritime boundaries that have been defined by the Treaty of London, Lausanne, and Paris, right after World War I, World War II, the Treaty or the Convention of Montreux, ensuring free navigation through the Dardanelles, Bosphorus. In other words, all of these issues now that have not been discussed for almost a century in some cases are now open for discussion, possible revision, abrogation, nullification. So if you take all of these components, including this short chronology and timeline I gave you, we have an environment in this part of the world, the Eastern Med, which is, from a geopolitical, military security, and also from an economic perspective in relationship to the energy opportunities, a target-rich environment, which equates to a high-risk zone, which could, under certain circumstances, lead to a disruption, fundamental disruption in the geopolitical balance of power, which includes a change in the alliance systems and friendship agreements that many countries have, including Turkey. Or it could lead to conflict at one level or another. And the trajectory right now is towards that part of the spectrum, which is why the meeting tomorrow between President Erdogan and President Trump is very important. As was the recent meeting, I believe last week or 2 weeks ago, between the Greek foreign minister and his Russian counterpart, Minister Lavrov, which I think took place within the context of the October 5 revised mutual defense agreement between Greece and the U.S. That lays out an environment wherein the ability to extract the massive resources of gas and oil in the Eastern Mediterranean can be problematic. And if it's problematic, it means that the high expectations that were built, that massive flows of revenues would come to various jurisdictions, may prove to be flawed. And if they prove to be flawed or incorrect, this could have serious political, economic, and security consequences. And I'll give you one example, and then I'll just wrap up. One of the characteristics of the phenomenon of Eastern Mediterranean energy, apart from the establishment of the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum with headquarters in Cairo, has been a lot of discussion in media coverage of the Eastern or the East Med pipeline, which would run from the Israeli coast, where there are very significant gas deposits, through Cypriot territorial waters onto Greece and then Italy. This pipeline...
This will be across the Mediterranean.
Yeah,
basically.
subsea.
Subsea.
Yeah.
Yes.
About 2,200 kilometers, and depending on the source, could carry 10 to 20 billion cubic meters of gas. Let me put that in perspective. The recently approved Russian Gazprom Nord Stream 2, which Denmark just approved through permitting, and which will be completed maybe by the end of December, has two pipelines. Each pipeline will carry 55 billion cubic meters, 110 billion cubic meters to Germany from Russia per year. This particular East Med pipeline has been viewed by a number of private sector platforms, non-NGOs, policy institutes, governments, as the basis upon which, in my opinion, to build a new security architecture. This new security architecture would encompass Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. In all likelihood, and I'd probably give it 90% probability, that pipeline will never be built.
It's too expensive.
So the question is, how can you construct a new security architecture on a myth? If you're going to do that, it has to be based on something else. And that's an example of the type of miscalculation that can arise if one does not take into account, apart from political aspirations driven by various interests, as Dr. Dupuy referenced, if you do not take into account market conditions. In other words, the planners of this new security architecture and then the promoters of the pipeline. And promoters of pipelines or any major energy projects, in most cases, will do this. They'll hype, they'll exaggerate, they'll fabricate, if necessary, the value of any given project because they want to attract investors. And once they attract investors, they'll sit down and give them the real numbers, but at least you bring the investor to the table, right? So the hype and the expectations around this pipeline, I believe, will be proven false. And there will have to be a readjustment on the quality of the security architecture that has been proposed, which I believe was one of the reasons why Turkey has reacted in the manner that it has in terms of sending drill ships into offshore Cypriot waters and addressing the issue in the manner that the Turkish Foreign Minister, the Turkish Energy Minister, and the President have addressed the matter. So, in other words, we have a heightened level of confrontation between Turkey and a number of countries, including the United States, that is based on a false premise. If that's the case, and I believe it is, and that's a serious indictment of geopolitical calculations, which is why we're invited to speak to these issues. So I think it's important to look at, and the contribution I want to make here, which may be a little different than the norm, is you have to look at the market. You cannot build a pipeline. You cannot sell liquefied natural gas, even though you have all the gas in the world, unless you have a buyer. Can't be done. You cannot begin construction and put investment funds into a pipeline until you're contracted with a buyer in Europe. There is no buyer in Europe. Why is there no buyer in Europe? Anybody?
Plenty of supply.
They're buying from somewhere else.
Too expensive.
It's going to be too costly.
Those are part of it, but that's not the fundamental response I want. One more? Anyone else? No? Okay. The reason why there are no buyers in Europe, which is what the promoters of the pipeline had hoped for, and in many ways they were quite legitimate in hoping for it. I'm going to pass this around. Here, pass it around.
Sure.
No, this is different. Is that natural gas prices in Europe have collapsed. They're at 50% lower than what they were last year, and 50% lower than what they were in 2016. It's a structural change. It's not going to get any higher. You have to have prices of about $9 per unit in Europe to get this East Med pipeline built. Right now, in Europe, it's at $5 and lower. And why is that the case? Because we have an international glut of natural gas. Thanks in large part, not just to Russia with that massive volume coming in on Nord Stream 2, but because of U.S. shale fracking and LNG exports from the U.S. Gulf Coast, depressing prices permanently. In other words, much cheaper to bring in U.S. LNG to Spain, and we have like 5 or 6 cargoes of LNG into Turkey in the first half of this year, rather than spending $10-15 billion on the pipeline up front that doesn't have a buyer. So, finally then, could this have been predicted? Yes, of course it was predicted. It was predicted 10 years ago that we would have a glut, an oversupply of crude oil and natural gas. So it's a fallacy to say that promoters, not just of this pipeline, but didn't know that prices would be depressed and they couldn't sell. Of course they knew. They were hoping for geopolitical changes, spike the price up or something. That will not happen now because the U.S. is the largest oil producer in the world, the largest natural gas producer, soon to be probably the #1 exporter of LNG and possibly crude oil. And that is the key to answering some of these issues regarding the Eastern Med. There are a number of other issues, but I think I'll stop there and give you okay.
But first of all, thanks to both of you for this great introduction. Let me just kick off this conversation asking a couple of questions. So what you said just now, in a sense, would turn all this debate on its head by saying, what are we really fighting about? Because, as you indicated, we have a glut of supply because of the reduced consumption in Europe in part, the Nord Stream 2 coming online and other things, and of course U.S. LNG exports coming into places from Lithuania to Poland to Turkey and what have you, and more terminals being essentially coming online soon, which is LNG exports from the Gulf Coast here in the U.S. will increase, whether they go to Japan, Korea, or Turkey, or Italy. It's a different, whatever. So, but can we say then that this whole squabble about the control and who has sovereignty and jurisdiction on these coveted natural resources is really a debate about false issues, because this stuff is not as valuable as the promoters would like, not just of the pipeline, but because conceivably you could have Greek Cypriot gas that could be turned into LNG and shipped in different places without a pipeline, conceivably, right? But is this kind of a debate about nothing? Meaning about a resource that is not as valuable as those who got engaged into it at the beginning thought? Is that a fair criticism, or is it too much?
Well, I think it has to be put in context. These resources are exceedingly valuable to the surrounding domestic markets. The optimum scenario is of a regional integrated energy system, which is badly needed. Turkey is totally dependent on gas and oil
From other
imports.
countries, yes.
And if it has offshore deposits of oil and gas, certainly they would want to develop that. You have brownouts, blackouts in Lebanon and Gaza, and in Lebanon that's leading in part to these massive protests. You could have a similar situation in Egypt. In other words, there's a political calculation here where developing these resources are really important for all of these surrounding countries, plus it's a revenue generator that's badly needed throughout the region. And that's one of the reasons I work with Dr. Dupuy, because I think he's one of the most forward-thinking and innovative thinkers that we have here in Washington. And that's the sort of mindset that might be able to address these issues. On the other side of the spectrum, yes, you have a high degree of risk that could lead to conflict.
But so, can we say then, if the solution, as you indicated, and Arnold, maybe please chime in here, would you say that then the ideal environment would be a regional arrangement with the parties involved? And as you indicated at the beginning in your introduction, there are many with different expectations and different angles. Can we have a regional arrangement whereby then the gas is used locally? Egypt has found gas, but it's not enough, certainly for its own domestic supply. They could use more. Jordan needs gas. Lebanon needs gas. Turkey needs gas. Is there a ground? Can we find the elements of a common ground, which of course would have to include at some point some kind of a settlement of the Cypriot issue, which is not visible at the moment, and therefore to properly and productively utilize this energy resources for regional consumption? Is that, I mean, I know this looks like a nice idea, but is this just a dream under the present circumstances? Is it just a kind of a hallucination here, or is it something we can work towards?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, that being optimistic that when the profit motive is there, that people can at least to some extent put aside their political differences and come to some kind of an arrangement where you're able to extract some rents from this. So I think that can happen, and I think the local market is going to be the impetus of this. When this happens, I don't know. I mean, just to say that people have been talking about using the energy bonanza in the Eastern Mediterranean to force through some of these long-standing diplomatic issues. I've been saying that since they discovered these deposits 10 years ago. So I say that will happen. Whether it'll happen soon, whether it's going to take time for the parties to realize that they really need to, for the sake of their populations, for their own dependency issues, they need to work around a solution initially for the commercial aspect of this, trying to derive some type of a profit sharing, some type of a means of sharing the revenues, and then work towards whatever long-term political solution that can be derived from this.
This platform that you mentioned, both of you, I think, which I think is headquartered in Cairo, in Egypt, about this
gas forum, yes.
Yes, this gas. Is it effective? Is it working? In other words, is this really a forum for productive? Is this a talking shop, blah blah, or is this a place where people can actually come forward and produce ideas that can be brought to governments and then implemented and find some kind of a common ground?
My take on it was that it's a fairly loose organization. I guess time will tell how effective it is, but the fact that you have the parties together, with the exception of Turkey and Lebanon, who are not part of this, the various entities get together and discuss this, which I think is a step in the right direction.
But there you go. Turkey is not there. Turkey has to be there.
Absolutely.
If not,
Absolutely.
this is not going to
that
hold.
Means, again, I'm not clear if Turkey was not invited or if they decided not to go. Paul Michael may have a better.
What's your take on this?
Perspective on
Is this kind of the projected place for venue for productive negotiations, or just another distraction?
Well, the forum was established in January. There was a second meeting of energy ministers in July, where a committee was established to study upgrading the forum to organizational level, internationally recognized organization. And I think this is very interesting, very important to watch, because the grouping will have to make a fundamental decision as to whether it is committed to commercial and economic goals, or if it intends to be a political and security platform. And I think that's fundamental to whether or not Turkey, Syria, Lebanon would want to join. Now, interestingly, in September, at a conference, a World Energy Conference in Abu Dhabi, the petroleum minister of Egypt, Minister Al-Molla, Tariq Al-Molla, said, when he was asked about the forum, he said, business interests come before our political differences. And I think that's a good
Starting point.
starting point.
Yes.
But that has to be institutionalized. In other words, if it's perceived, rightly or wrongly, if it's perceived that the forum is nothing more than a fig leaf to advance a new security framework in the region, no, Turkey will not join, nor Syria. Lebanon's problematic. But if it's perceived that it's committed towards a regional commercial enterprise that could eventually lead to an integrated grid system, then that's a different optic. And we'll have to see where this goes. The United States is fundamental to this process. U.S. DOE was instrumental in establishing the forum in January. We have a new leader over the Department of Energy, and we'll see where the emphasis will be. So there's a lot here on the plate between Turkey and Egypt, Turkey and the United States, Egypt and the United States. I really look at Egypt within this configuration as a pivotal player. Even though there are a lot of issues between Turkey and Egypt, I think there's a recognition that Egypt is the leader of this group, and it sets the agenda. A lot of people think it's Israel. No, it's not Israel, it's Egypt. Egypt because it's the hub on the southern end, as Turkey is on the northern, for processing. And that's where the money is. It's on the processing and marketing of your petroleum, whether it's oil or crude, and then exporting it if you can.
Let me ask you a different question, then we can throw it open for the discussion with our guests here. Given what you described, which is really very problematic and complex, and again, the business case for this pipeline is kind of not there, and Europe, as you said, is already oversupplied, and so we're talking about regional use of these energy resources. What is the commercial case for the companies that are now drilling in the Greek Cypriot waters? My understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the Leviathan gas offshore of Israel will be really used mostly for Israel itself, and some of it to Jordan, right? If I understand correctly. And the Zohr gas offshore from Egypt, by the way, which was developed by Eni, is for also almost entirely for domestic consumption, because Egypt desperately needs energy to buttress economic development, and it's an energy poor country. So that being the case, the Cypriot gas that these companies that you talked about, Total, Eni, Exxon, and others are drilling for, what's their commercial plan? In other words, given all these uncertainties and given the active dispute with Turkey regarding territorial waters and who is allowed to do what, they strike stuff. Okay, they get it. All right, then they put it up, and then what? Where does it go? What's the short-term or medium-term plan? The pipeline being literally a pipe dream. So where does this go? Yeah, I can get another. Your chairs are outside there. Please. We have other chairs. So where does this go? In other words, at the moment, these companies are there to make money, right? I suppose, not for fun. So they go there, they drill, and then what happens to the gas that they eventually will come and it will be in commercially viable amounts? At the moment, what's the end game, as we know now, regardless of any future plan of regional cooperation and this and that and settlement of the geopolitical outstanding problems in territorial waters and whatnot? What are they doing? these guys?
Well, if I were to answer that question, the first thing I would say is there are all kinds of discoveries of gas around the world. That's not an issue. The issue is the extraction and commercialization of these deposits. So when you're dealing with offshore, maritime, deep water, and here it is, very deep water, up to 4,000 meters in some cases, the geology is difficult, very expensive. So in the case of offshore Cyprus with the Aphrodite field, which was discovered around, I guess, 2010, according now to the last MOU and whatnot, between Cyprus and the consortium, which includes Noble and Exxon and Delek from Israel, it will probably be around 2025 when the first volumes begin to flow.
Out.
So that's 15 years. If the timeline is adhered to, there's still a lot of licensing, feed, front-end engineering design issues, testing. It's not a done deal, even if you have a buyer on the Egyptian end to process it. Prices can shift. The natural gas prices that you saw could go even lower than what we've seen already. You may have geopolitical issues between Israel and Egypt. There may be a change of leadership in Egypt between now and 2025. There may be changes in the configuration around Cyprus between Turkey and Cyprus and the Northern Republic. I mean, these are all circumstances and events that can take place that could alter that timeline or nullify it. It's not like you're drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. That's what I mean by a target-rich environment. And then after everything's completed and you actually have volumes coming out, then the revenue sharing agreement and the purchase and sell agreements can shift again. All these companies want their recovery costs up front once the volumes start to come in. All the investment they've made over the last 10, 15 years have to be recovered. So it's going to be a long time before a given jurisdiction sees significant revenue flow into their treasury. And that's just with one particular field. Exxon discovered another huge field offshore Cyprus. I forget what block, but the earliest before we see commercialization and volume coming out would be the mid-2030s. Well, the world will change 2-3 times over between now and then. So you cannot project outwards based on this very fluid situation. Just like we said earlier, the market in Europe has dramatically altered within a space of 12 months, including large volumes of U.S. LNG that no one saw coming 2-3 years ago, including Nord Stream 2 coming online probably by the end of December, despite all of the headlines.
But that's not additional supply. That's,
No, what I'm saying is those are circumstances and events
yeah.
that take place contrary to conventional wisdom. So again, in terms of companies, our U.S. companies, ExxonMobil and Chevron, and you have a lot of options because they're big. They have deep pockets, and they can go to Mozambique and they can go here. But increasingly, our U.S. companies, even the big players, are pulling out of international plays in a manner that is unprecedented. And they're putting their money, their investment, into U.S. shale production. You don't have to worry about risk. You don't even have to worry about discovery. You know that the oil and gas is there. and you have a very enticing environment given deregulation and so forth. So why would you want to go over to places like Eastern Mediterranean, get involved with all of this risk factor? You know, so there's no assurance even that big players like Exxon and Chevron, even Total, which has huge investments in the Gulf of Mexico with the new LNG terminals being built, there's no guarantee they're going to stay unless they see a stable environment that will be there for some time within which they can operate. So again, my point here is that this is a very fluid situation. It can change from month to month, day to day. Nothing is guaranteed. The only guaranteed thing Arnie said at the beginning is the ability to produce X amount of volume from your natural gas deposits and to a lesser degree oil deposits for domestic consumptions in the surrounding jurisdictions. That's the money play. That's a safe bet. Everything else is problematic.
One last question, then we'll throw it up for discussion. Any odds about a settlement in Cyprus? I know. In other words, is this is kind of a frozen situation, and it's been sadly frozen for decades. Do you see any of the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel based on what you have observed? Is there any chance? Because that would, talking about changing the atmosphere and lowering the temperature, that would contribute a lot.
Talk about the commercial environment or the...
I'm talking the whole thing.
Oh.
I'm talking about the commercial really is dependent on the politics, it seems to me. Can the two communities finally get together, find some kind of an arrangement, or this situation is frozen with essentially mutually exclusive options and two states, whatever you call them, whoever recognizes them, that's the way it's going to be, because that affects the atmosphere, obviously, and the relationship between Turkey and Cyprus and Greece and the EU and all that, right? So is that something that is off the table for the time being, or do you see any breakthrough? There was a proposal that came out, the referendum, that then wasn't approved.
I'd be reluctant to make any guesses or estimates, as a general statement. There have been some glimmers in the region over the last, say, few weeks maybe. But I think to a certain extent, commercial also drives the political. So it's sort of a cyclical type of situation where and I don't see any resolution happening in the immediate term. Certainly, as time goes on, I do think that if there's no confrontation, that the perceived benefits will outweigh any of the long-term intractable, or supposedly intractable political issues.
What's your take on this, if any?
Well, I see two possible options. And they're probably in the lower end of a probability scale, but still leading towards some sort of agreement resolution. One option is the personal relationship, the quality of the personal relationship between President Trump and President Erdogan. And I think that holds out the degree of hope. On that basis, some sort of understanding can be achieved. That would take time and other factors, but I think that's an important element. And again, I emphasize President Trump as opposed to the institutions of government because of the dysfunction that we see in Washington over the last couple of years. So the office of the presidency is critically important at this stage in that relationship. The second option would be a U.S.-Russia joint effort to resolve the situation, based in part because of the long-standing Greek-Cypriot-Russian relationship and Russian interest historically in Nicosia, and given now the relationship, the entente, if you will, between Ankara and Moscow. I think there's a confluence there that, again, with Washington involved, could lead to a possible dialogue and potential agreement.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. The floor is open. Please ask any questions you would like of our speakers. Yes, sir. Please, can you give us your name and...
Ken Meyercord, just a retiree interested in international affairs. Have the various parties agreed on the boundaries of their respective EEZs? Are there any oil resources affiliated with these gas resources? And is there any body to formulate and enforce environmental regulations?
Okay, point number 2 on oil. USGS estimates probably circa 2 billion barrels in reserve spread through that eastern Mediterranean region. It's probably more, but the discovery of this is still ongoing. Again, it's a question of commercialization, the quality of the crude, which would likely be a heavy crude. But nevertheless, if you can extract it at a reasonable cost for domestic consumption in the surrounding jurisdictions, it would be very helpful. But gas is paramount. Natural gas in terms of deposits is paramount in the region. In terms of the EEZ, you have 2 domains which are contentious. One between Lebanon and Israel. It's not a large acreage, and I think the United States is quietly mediating an agreement there, so I don't foresee a real issue on the boundary between Lebanon and Israel. But the most important one, the most critical one, is the surrounding claims with 3 jurisdictions in this case. The Greek Cypriot claims, the Turkish Cypriot claims, and Turkey itself, and the EEZ overlapping territories surrounding Cyprus. And if memory serves me right, 44-45% of what Nicosia claims as its jurisdiction in terms of EEZ is also claimed by Turkey and or the Northern Republic. I may be wrong on that, but these are all in dispute, as Dr. Dupuy referenced, with Turkish drilling ships going into what Cyprus claims is its own waters. Now, what's interesting, one of the claims that Turkey has, which is disputed by Cyprus, is the southernmost block, which if Turkey, and I believe it would be Turkey, so if Turkey succeeds in claiming that acreage, would actually be adjunct or border Israel's maritime boundary. So you would have a Turkish-Israeli shared border, maritime border. And I think that's very interesting and has all sorts of implications to it. In terms of environmental issues, again, that's where this sort of Eastern Mediterranean gas forum or a regional grid system could be the platform to address environmental issues. And look, let me say, I mentioned this in front of the Marine officers in terms of risk and in terms of black swans and unintended consequences and all. You all remember Deepwater Horizon, Gulf of Mexico. Yes. So you could have a rig offshore and someone decides, I really want to, I'm not happy with the way things are playing out. And you have deniability built in, and you could send an underwater drone or submarine or mine, a remote controlled mine, and you can puncture one of the legs of those rigs and the thing would blow up and you would have an environmental disaster in the Eastern Mediterranean that would put an end to all of this that we're talking about. Yeah. So you have state actors, you have non-state actors, you have private corporations, private individuals. You know, Libya is still in chaos.
Everybody except the UN, apparently.
Everybody except the UN. So, yes, you could have serious environmental degradation in that area. And of course, if you have seepage, given the currents in the area, it would flow from one jurisdiction to another. So there's a vested interest for all parties to try and find a platform where they can work together to prevent these type of issues or even a possible disaster, like we saw with Deepwater Horizon.
Let me just add to that real quick,
Please.
because there's the other dynamic is the Turkish and Greek claims in the Aegean. So there's some deposits there that both sides want to explore, but they're reluctant to do so because of this ongoing dispute there, which goes back to the 1920s with the Greek-Turkish war, that period. So there are multiple disputes over EEZs and so on throughout the region, as Paul Michael mentioned, the primary one being Cyprus.
Other questions?
I got another one then.
Oh, please, sir.
What's the status of Europe's imports of natural gas from North Africa?
Well, natural gas from Algeria,
It's piped mostly.
yeah, that's a traditional source of supply. Libya is offline, or I shouldn't say offline, but it's still a bit erratic, but they're developing enough stability there to maintain oil exports around 1.2 million barrels a day. There are really significant offshore deposits, Mauritania and Senegal and these areas which are being developed. Morocco has deposits. Well, again, you drill in your backyard, you will find natural gas or oil if you drill deep enough. It's just a question of the economics of the if you're in Western China, there are tremendous deposits of oil and gas, but you have to have a certain type of fracking technology to get those deposits open. Eventually the Chinese will figure it out, but it might take 5, 10, 15 years. So again, we don't know what the future is going to be like in North Africa and Algeria, which has been unstable now. They've had a change in political leadership. 5 years from now, we could see new discoveries, investment for more modern infrastructure with larger exports to Europe. And of course, that's another new
But those
elements.
exports from Algeria haven't peaked yet. I mean, we
No.
had the experience in Alaska where
No, you're right. They've not peaked, and as I mentioned, they could get. I think there are vast deposits in Algeria and Morocco as well, and you know, Sahara is a big area that hardly has been explored, and who knows what's out there. We keep discovering new deposits in places that are unheard of. For all we know, there may be significant deposits in Greenland, and maybe that's why President Trump was interested to annex Greenland. Who knows?
Just
Who knows?
buy, not on.
Or buy.
As a commercial
There
operation.
you go.
Other questions? Anybody? No? Have we exhausted completely? That's unbelievable. You have answered all the questions.
maybe we're too depressed.
Well, look, if there are no other questions, then let me thank our two speakers, and thank you so much for giving us an illustration of these complexities